Welcome back to this AD Layman Conference. And this afternoon's breakout session is entitled Batch Farrowing for Improved Health and Productivity. It's a continuation of a discussion we had last year at the Layman Conference that was very popular. And we recognize that batch farrowing is a technology that has been taken up a great deal, but still needs to be refined to be utilized to its greatest extent within the swine industry. So we've brought together a group of speakers that have been involved in this technology for some time, and we look forward to the discussions that we can have as well. Our first speaker is Dr. Clayton Johnson from Carthage Veterinary Services. You should recognize him as this year's Science and Practice awardee. He's been very involved in the swine industry, and the award is really a recognition and a testament not only to his clinical prowess, but also his generous support of the industry through conferences such as this, and also other activities and conferences on the international stage as well. His presentation is entitled Batch Farrowing Models and Their Impact on Health. Welcome, Dr. Johnson.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm excited to talk to you today about batch farrowing models and their impact on health. It's an honor to be a part of the 2020 Alan D. Layman Science Conference, always one of my favorite times of the year, and excited to be a part of it virtually this year. So batch farrowing, the first thing that we have to talk about is ultimately, what does this mean to the farm if we're going to switch over to a batch production program? One of the first things that you'll have to share with farm is that it's a tool that may end up decreasing your wean age. And I know that you may get some scratched heads there as they say, haven't we been focusing on pig quality here over the last 6 months pretty hard? And don't you always tell me that a pig with higher wean age is better? Understood, and we'll talk through that. Second point, batch farrowing can be a tool that might have a decrease in your PSY. And we'll talk about different models having a differing impact on PSY or wean age. And you really, as the producer or veterinarian, being able to choose what model is correct for you. But yes, ultimately, the sow farm may see a decreased PSY in the batch production system. The next couple of conversations you may have with the farm are going to be ones that are really special to the breeding and gestation team as well as the farrowing department. We're going to make life a little bit more complicated in those areas. In the breeding and gestation barn, the management of our gilts and when we might place those into breed groups becomes a little bit more difficult. How to manage abortions and return animals can become challenging because you're not breeding continuously. You're not breeding animals every day. And obviously those aborts and those returns have a very specific window in which their estrus will be in. And that window may not line up perfectly with where you're actually intending to breed animals for an upcoming breed group. In the farrowing house, we really see a combined amount of work because the breeding barn is going to breed multiple 8 weeks worth of animals into one group. We're going to see that group roll through the farrowing house. And whether it's attending farrowings or processing or wean shots, all of that work is going to have to be condensed into a shorter period of time. So I can assure you that the day you sit down with the farrowing team and explain to them that we won't have to process for 3 weeks, but on week number 4, we still have to process all of those pigs, there's probably going to be some eye rolls and some people that may not be terribly excited about this. And you're probably going to have to answer the question of ultimately, why are we talking about this? Negative impact to PSY, negative impact to wean age, all the different challenges we put on our breeding and gestation teams and our farrowing teams. Why are we going to do that? And ultimately, we have to look at this as a value proposition. Yes, it may make life slightly more complicated in some areas. And at the end of the day, it's change, and change is always hard on the farm. But if we look at the factors associated with profitability through the years, we typically see health factors rising to the top. Producers who best manage the health of their herds generally have a competitive advantage in terms of performance. Those producers often see that their nursery and finishing mortality and that their cull pigs from a marketing standpoint are lower than their competitors, and as a result, they have lower cost of production. And this slide just highlights an observational study done by Greg Bilbray when he was working with AgriStats, where he looked into the production factors that were best correlated with the overall profitability of swine production companies. The reason I share this is as we look through those top 5 factors, we don't see PSY and we don't see wean age listed there. And not that they aren't important, but at the end of the day, if we can improve health, it does appear that we may be able to improve profitability even beyond changes that we can make in PSY or in wean age alone. We talked a little bit about the negatives of batch production already. The brutal honesty is you're going to have less efficient use of your farrowing crates. Your farrowing crates are your most important asset. They're the most expensive part of your pig farm on a per square footage basis. So it's extremely important that we turn those farrowing crates. The farrowing crates on a sow farm are the bottleneck of our sow farm supply chain. No different than our packing plant shackle spaces are the bottleneck for our overall industry. We back that up a few steps. Each step within the supply chain has its own bottleneck, and our farrowing crates at our sow farm are our bottleneck for the live production stage of pig production. So the lower wean age, the lower PSY that is inferred from that less efficient farrowing crate use has to be taken into account. We also need to think about those surges in labor needed for the farrowing house, as well as the breeding house, the processing, all the cleaning and sanitation that has to be done between groups. We've got to think about those. Perhaps there's a way to flip those into a positive. What I mean by that is we have a lot of work to do at one point in time. If we have multiple farms that are on a batch, and the batch is rotating in terms of the work being done on each farm across time, say we're on 4-week batch programs, and we have 4 farms that are matched up, so they alternate every week. They are rotating through the batches independently. If we can feel comfortable moving our employees from farm to farm in that scenario, we can actually specialize our labor force. The same amount of breeding has to be done. The same amount of processing has to be done. The same amount of attended farrowings have to be done. If we can put our best breeders on more breeds, because our head breeder at our best farm is now rotating through other farms as it's their turn to breed on the batch, and coordinating and executing the breeding on those farms, I think we can actually see that specialist model of pig production end up producing more pigs for us. And you'll hear me say that a couple of times. If you can share labor, and if you can share gilts across multiple farms that are staggered in sequence on their batch, I think you have a tremendous advantage against other producers that can't do that and are considering batch production. Some other benefits that I want to point out, and really the driving value proposition for batch production, is improved endemic health. Many of us have struggled with pathogens such as strep, Haemophilus parasuis, mycoplasma, pneumoniae, all of those endemic pathogens that tend to impact our pigs, and maybe we would like to eradicate it someday, but it's not in the plan for 2020 or 2021. Batch production can help to reduce those impacts, and we'll talk specifically about how here in a few slides. Batch production can also help you with disease elimination. Let's say you get PED into your herd. Let's say you get a new wild type herd strain in that you want to eliminate, or maybe it's just an old foe like mycoplasma you decide that you want to eliminate. Batch production can definitely help to facilitate that. It's got a built-in emptying of the farrowing house that gives you the opportunity to eliminate disease faster. When we talk about batch production, I always like to start with this core tenet of population disease medicine. And this is really a principle that we took out of public health. And I think you'll see some analogies as we talk through this with the current worldwide COVID situation. The reality is that all of us as individuals live somewhere within the continuum of either being susceptible to a pathogen, infected by the pathogen, or resistant to the pathogen because we are immunocompetent. We've been exposed to the pathogen somehow, some way. And really the development of population level resistance is the concept of herd immunity that we've all heard so much about in the news lately, and that we hope that we achieve at some point with COVID as a human population. As a pig, you're generally born susceptible to most of the pathogens that you're going to be exposed to. Now, our goal with population disease medicine is really to shepherd populations through this process collectively. And the move from susceptible to infected can be one of a natural exposure where we allow the sow or other piglets to expose the population to the pathogens that are there, or it could be a planned exposure, particularly as we think about gilt acclimation. We think about planned exposure to mycoplasma or other pathogens, where we're going to try and get them infected at the same time so that we don't have susceptibles and infected in the population at the same time. That's our goal with stable health, is we really want to usher a population of pigs collectively from susceptible to infected and resistant. If we do that, if we get the entire population in the infected category at roughly the same time, we can maximize our resource application. We can be most efficient with the timing of it. We can put vaccines in place. We can put medication in place. Whatever intervention strategy you and your veterinarian have come up with, we can precisely apply it to the period in time in which the pigs collectively need it the most. Rather than having this kind of rolling 10% of the population that's going through the infected stage at any point in time, we want to minimize the number of susceptibles, move everybody to infected together, and help usher them through that infection with the least amount of clinical disease present at any given time through the strategic use of vaccination and medication. And remember, infection does not equal disease. Our goal in this situation is to minimize the cost of disease by minimizing the duration and volume of infection. If we get these pigs to resistant and they're market pigs, we've done our job. At that point, they should be on cruise control. If those pigs happen to be growing gilts, we'd really like to get them to the resistant stage before they farrow their first litter. So they're no longer shedding the pathogen of concern, and they're immunocompetent, and they can share their immune system via the passive transfer of colostrum to their piglets when they're born. Now, I want to give you really an example of two different styles of production system that help drive this concept home to me. On the left is a traditional farrow to finish farm, and it's one that's very near and dear to my heart. I grew up working on this farm as a young man in West Central Illinois. On the right is a modern sow farm, and it's really an example of where segregated production is today. And the modern sow farm was built for continuous production, because we weren't constrained by the growing pig space that was only available on our small farrow to finish farm. We could wean off site with modern sow farm production. So we really weren't limited on the number of days in a certain period, whether that's weeks or months, that we could wean. We could wean every day if we wanted to, which means we'll have sows that come into heat every day, which means we'll breed every day and farrow every day. Great for throughput of the farrowing house, but we'll see how that's a challenge for population disease management. As we think about this traditional farm, this was outdoor gestation. So the breeding and gestation were these dirt lots that you can see now covered in grass. But when I was a kid, those dirt lots were where we would take the wean sows, drop them in, throw a few boars in there, and then we'd come back 3 months later and look to see who had heavy underlines, and those animals would move up into the farrowing house as one group. If I remember right, there were 35 farrowing crates in this one farrowing house. One room, one farrowing house, all one unit. We would load it all at one time with those animals that were the most heavy bred. And obviously, because they were naturally bred, there was a wide range in the breeding dates, and I should say conception dates, on those animals. There was also a pretty wide range in the farrowing dates. They would stay in there for a 5-week period. So for 35 days, they would stay in. If she farrowed the day she came in there, she'd have 35-day-old pigs when she weaned. If she waited 2 weeks to farrow, she'd have 21-day-old pigs when they weaned. But collectively, we would wean that entire room when the nursery came available. When space opened up 5 weeks after we'd fill the farrowing room, because we emptied the nursery, we'd wash that nursery, and we would move those piglets, wean those piglets into that hot nursery. After 5 weeks of growing in the hot nursery, they'd move to the grower. And after 5 weeks in the grower, they'd become one of 3 different batches that were in the finisher. And you can see how this system really moves one step to the other just as space becomes available. You're constrained by space, so you're naturally on a batch that matches your space. Challenging for facility throughput. It really has a ceiling on facility throughput that continuous production or multi-site production can't accomplish. But look at the health benefits. Say you're a piglet born in that farrowing house. You're born susceptible to fill in the blank pathogen you want to talk about, E. coli, whatever your endemic pathogen of concern is. You become infected, hopefully in that farrowing house, and again as one group. And you ultimately move to transition into a population of resistant animals. Collectively, you were exposed together, you were vaccinated together, you were medicated together. all the intervention strategies were appropriately applied, and as a group, you moved into the resistant category and you hit that cruise control that we want for population health in terms of our growing market pigs. That's the definition of stable health from my perspective. Moving the group through each stage till we get to the resistant category, and doing that as one whole population without susceptibles still hanging out to stir the infection pot, that's success. If we think about continuous production and we look at the farm system on the right, very similar to probably what you're familiar with. One big breeding and gestation barn where all the breeding and gestation occurred, and we have the ability to breed animals every day on this farm. No concerns about space because we can wean the pigs off-site anytime we want to. One big farrowing house, and can't see it in this picture, but there are actually 4 rooms in that farrowing house, each of 60 crates, okay? And so we literally have piglets that are being born in a room right next to piglets that are being weaned. And in that farrowing house, we have susceptible, we have infected, we have resistant animals. We have all 3 classes of animals together. And that, to me, unfortunately, is the definition of unstable health. And it's probably going to be unstable when we wean those pigs. You're probably going to have animals of each category when you wean those pigs. So let's talk about the different models of batch, the production that are available to producers, and the pros and cons of each of them. Let's start with really continuous production, because I think it helps to get our head around what that model looks like on paper so we can compare it to batch production models. I call this the 21 continuous production model, or depending on your lean age, it may be 21-1. And it really is just doing what we all do every day in gestation barns, and that's categorizing our breed groups by week. Okay, we're breeding every day. So when we start our imaginary startup farm, you can see this first group that we've got down here in lactation was bred on days 1 through 7. So the first week, we call that week 1 if we bred those animals the first week in January, the breed group number 1. They're going to farrow 115 days later. So we can put some assumptions down here that in our continuous breeding, we're going to breed 7 days a week, and that we're going to have 115 days of gestation. And that 115 days of gestation, there's obviously nothing we can do about that. So we've got 4 weeks worth of animals that we can hold in our lactation in most farrowing houses, 4 breed groups at any given time. And when that 5th breed group is ready to farrow, we know we have to wean breed group number 1. They have to come in the farrowing house to farrow, so we can dictate that if we want to load them at, say, day 112 or 112 of gestation, we know the exact day that that breed group 1 has to get kicked out of the farrowing house so we can wash it, get cleaned up, and ready to receive those animals. If you think about this design as you think about continuous production, now think about this design as you think about batch production. This is probably one of the most common batch models that's out there. It's the 5-4 batch model, where you have 5 groups of 4 weeks worth of animals each. Okay, so 21 or 5-4. It's the same 20 weeks of animals. They're just grouped differently in terms of the dates of their breeding, which then infers different groups of the dates of their farrowing and their weaning. The same concepts apply. So in this situation, we're going to assume we do 5 days of breeding on that batch. And each batch is 4 weeks long, so that's 28 days. And for the first batch, in days 1 through 5, those are our breed dates. Days 6 through 28, there's no breeding. Once we hit day 29, we start to breed batch number 2, again for 5 days. 115 days of gestation, nothing we can do about that. 3 empty crate days, that is something that we can do. If we could more precisely tell when an animal was going to farrow, we could decrease those crate days by holding them in gestation longer. Today, we don't really have that ability, so I think most of us are going to require 3 empty crate days to get the crates cleaned up, make sure we can get the disinfection done, and ultimately load them at gestation day 112 so that they can have 3 gestation days in the farrowing crates. That is set by the breed date of our second group in this situation, because we're all in, all out in our farrowing house in this model. When group number 2 gets to that point where they're at gestation day 112, we need them to have moved into lactation. That's our goal with this model. Advantages here, we're all in, all out in the farrowing house, okay? Also advantage, we're gonna have more litters per sow per year in this model than in some other options, okay? Good health advantage because we're all in, all out in the farrowing house. Good throughput advantage because we have an increased litter per sow per year because we're going to turn those farrowing crates faster. You'll see that in a couple models. Downside, wean age. Obviously, as litters per sow per year go up, wean age is likely going to come down. Now, the other all-in, all-out farrowing house model I want to expose you to is the 4-5 model. This is 4 groups of 5 weeks. So instead of a 28-week batch, we have a 28-day batch, we have a 35-day batch. Same principles, except I changed one of the assumptions here, and that's that we're going to do 10 days of breeding. Because it's a 35-week window, some producers will extend the breeding day on the 4-5 model so that they have more opportunities to catch those returns, to catch those gilts, to catch those aborts that can be hard to place into groups if you've got 3 to 4 weeks of no breeding activity on the farm. I want you to notice that the breed day for the second group is now day 36. Because we bred them a week later than in our previous batch model, we don't have to load them into the farrowing house till a week later. That increases the wean age. Downside, it also decreases the litter per sow per year, which is a key component of the pigs per sow per year. Throughput is compromised in this model, but if wean age is more important to you, this is a great model for you. All the health advantages of all-in, all-out production in the farrowing house, all the health advantages of higher wean age, the consequence, of course, comes to throughput. Now let's talk about 2 different batch models in which your farrowing house is really broken up into 2 different groups. You've got 2 breed groups in the farrowing house at any given time. If you only have 1 farrowing house, there's probably some minor health consequence to this. Still better than continuous production, but you don't ever have that built-in clean out of the entire farrowing house. If you've got 2 farrowing houses and they're the same size, this may have all the benefits of the other all-in, all-out batch production models because you'll actually clean out your farrowing house. So your farm design can have a pretty big impact on which model is going to be right for you and how much health benefit you can get out of the various models. In the 10-2 model, we have 10 groups in 2-week batches. So we're breeding more frequently in this. It's a little easier on the breeding and gestation barn because they don't have to manipulate animals as much to drop them into specific breed dates. We're going to breed the first group on day 1 through 5. I said we'll have 5 days breeding here because we're really going to be breeding more often than we did in the other models we talked about. The group that's out here in gestation that's going to need to come in, it was bred started on day 29. So this model, like the first one we looked at, has throughput advantages. The downside with that is wean age. Okay, you're going to have to wean these animals earlier than in the previous model that we talked about. All right, so always think about that inverse. You can choose batch production models that have high wean age, they're going to have lower throughput. You can choose ones that have higher throughput, they're going to have lower wean age. These are decisions we make all the time on the sow farm, but with continuous production, we're talking about a day either direction. In the batch world, you're generally talking about more than a day, so the decisions have a little more consequence. The last one I want to share with you is the 7-3 batch model. 7 groups, 3 weeks per batch, okay? This one is going to have a big impact on your throughput. This one is not ideal from a throughput standpoint. You can see when we started breeding this last batch here, or I should say the 3rd batch that's going to go into the farrowing house and push batch number 1 out. Day 43 was when we started breeding versus day 29 in some of the other models. So you're not going to have the throughput that we see with the others. You also don't have the all-in, all-out production in the farrowing house. How important is that to you? Kind of depends on your farm design and how much health help you need from this batch production model. The value proposition here is you have a lot of breeding days in the cycle. So 10 days of breeding out of a 21-day cycle, you're essentially breeding half of the days in the cycle. So a little easier for your breeding and gestation group to manage. If you've only got one source of gilts and you can't share gilts with somebody, if you've only got one source of labor and no ability to share labor across farms, maybe this model is for you. So let's talk about some specific health opportunities that the batch production can create for you. First and foremost, gilt litter offspring. They're hard to raise. They're hard to raise in the farrowing house. They're hard to raise in the wean to finish barn. All of us have walked through farrowing houses and really been astounded by 100% of the gilt litters that have a scour issue and none of the multi-parent sow litters having any scour issue. And we get very nervous when we come to a litter like this and we see a gilt litter on maybe one side of the divider that's scouring really hard and some other pigs on the other side of the divider that aren't scouring as hard. And we're worried about that pathogen transmission. If not underneath those farrowing dividers, if not somehow, some way from an employee that's moving through the barn, we've got to process these pigs. We've got to do lots of things to them. Our opportunity here in a batch production system is to parity segregate at least within the farrowing rooms. We can have farrowing rooms that are set up specific to all gilt litters. Now, there'll obviously probably be at least one room in the farrowing house that has to be split between multi-paris and gilt litters, But we've got a nice setup here to try and contain the health challenge within those gilt litters as best we can. We also can transition that out into the wean to finish system. And I would tell you, a savvy producer might look at this and say, well, you're telling me my wean pigs, the parity 1 pigs are the least valuable ones. The gilt litter pigs are the least valuable ones. Well, maybe if I'm going to make a decision to sell some pigs, I should sell that parity 1 offspring. And certainly I think that's something that you could consider if you don't need those pigs and if you can find a good buyer for that situation. Somebody's got small barns, that parity 1 offspring may be perfect for them to raise up. If you are a large producer, have large sites, you want those multi-paris pigs, but maybe the gilt litter pigs you could sell off. You obviously can also parity seg within your system. Not many producers have wean to finish space that's set up to be able to do that, because your gilt litter flow obviously has smaller space requirements than your multi-paris flow will. But if you have that set up and you can take advantage of it, huge advantages to being able to raise your gilt litter pigs independently and manage the vaccination, medication, and management program effectively for those pigs. Give those pigs to your best growers with the best barns. They will do the best in those situations. Disease elimination. I mentioned at the beginning that you can absolutely facilitate disease elimination faster with batch production. And I think that's very true and something that we have to highlight, particularly in today's day and age of epidemic disease challenges, where it seems like there's always something new coming at us. There's very good evidence out there that whether it's influenza or PRRS, you can decrease the time to negative production. Certainly with PED, producers know this, they're very attuned to it. If you get really lucky on the right batch cycle, you might never completely lose a batch in PED outbreak, okay? At a minimum, you should be able to clean up after 1 batch. And that's a really nice benefit of batch production. Been a lot of discussion in the industry over the last 6 months about removing pigs and which pigs to remove to make the industry profitable again. To me, I've been a little puzzled by some of the decisions I've heard to just abort all the pigs for a period of time, or get rid of all the pigs for a period of time. If I wanted to take, say, 10% out of our herd, I would want to take the least valuable 10% out of our herd. And to me, just taking entire groups of animals out doesn't necessarily accomplish that. We've got a wonderful leading indicator of performance in birth weight. And whether you're talking about commercial pig production or gilt production, birth weight is critically important to the future growth performance of that pig. Some wonderful work done by the University of Illinois through the years to highlight this, and this has really been well researched. If we need to take out 10% of the population, let's take out 10% of the low birth weight pigs. Let's start right there. Least amount of cost in those pigs, very precisely applied intervention. That seems like a good decision to me. I think that's something that producers should really think about if they're going into a batch. I said that your throughput will be somewhat constrained. Can you overbreed and over-farrow so that you still wean the number of pigs that you want, but it does require some removal of pigs on day 1 once you've got those birth weights recorded? Something to think about. Something that is kind of on the misunderstood side, I think, is that the scheduling of a batch can really be a benefit to a wean to finish producer. What I mean by that is they're going to get a lot of pigs all at one time. But if you're on a batch program, you should wean on Monday. You should always wean on Monday on a batch program. Why should you wean on Monday? Well, not only does it drop in a lot of those breeds at the end of the week when you've got your farm staff there, but you've also got the wean to finish benefits of having those pigs looked at Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The first 5 days they're there at the wean to finish farm and they're starting up, which we know are the most critical. Those are weekdays. Like it or not, weekends are probably going to have a chance that there's maybe a little less labor available, whether it's wean to finish farm or a sow farm. So when those pigs are weaned on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, what are they getting for care on Saturday and Sunday? Are they getting that intense help that they need on day 2, day 3, day 4, post-weaning, those most critical days where we know getting them started on feed and water is huge for a successful startup. I think this one's fairly intuitive in that batch production allows you to provide your nutrition, your management, and your ventilation strategies very precisely. We're not looking at 2 to 4 weeks of age spread across the barn. We're looking at a very, very tight range in age. We can manage the resources of the pigs very effectively and ultimately market them as a very tightly aged group. Nurse sows can be a challenging one for fallback management or dead sow replacement in a batch production. I would tell you that I do think that milk decks can be a nice resource in the batch production, but they have to be used correctly. Okay, never put fallback pigs or challenge pigs in the milk deck. If you need a replacement sow, Go to the best sow in the room with the best litter. Take your whole litter of pigs, remove those, and wean them into the milk deck. And then use that sow for the replacement sow, whether that's for fallback pigs or another sow that's not milking or a dead sow, okay? Never take those challenge pigs and put them into the milk deck because they just become a scour nightmare in that situation. So a few lessons learned, and then we'll wrap up here. All in, all out models, the farrowing house generally are going to provide the greatest health advantage. You do want to target extra breedings over crate capacity. We didn't hit a lot on that in the presentation, but the last thing you want is an empty farrowing crate in your batch production. Make sure that you have extra breeds, excuse me, so that you've got full farrowing houses at all times. Milk decks are good tools. Don't use them for fallback piglets because you'll have a scour issue. The ability to rotate your specialized labor is a huge advantage. I said it at the beginning. You've got multiple farms sequenced on a batch, and you can move your best breeder from one farm to another, your best person at attending farrowings from one farm to another. You'll see the performance benefits from that come through on all farms. Same thing with your gilts. If you can service multiple farms on a sequenced batch from one common gilt developer, you don't have to manipulate the estrus of the gilt with hormones. You can simply send the gilt to the farm that will breed on our natural estrus, and that's a wonderful advantage. Make sure you get extra equipment. You get a lot of cleaning to do between batches, power washers, processing carts. You don't want equipment to be a limiting issue in getting work done on the farm. Significant health improvements, not only on the endemic side, whether it's strep or E. coli or ASUS, parasuis, whatever your issue is, I can tell you there will be endemic benefits for batch production. Also, epidemic disease benefits, facilitating disease elimination. Maybe something that's always been there that you want to get rid of, maybe the next PRRS, the next PED, the next influenza that comes in. Cost to consider: what's your impact to your litters per sow per year and your throughput? What's your impact to your wean age? Do you have to spend money on hormones to manage the gilts and get them into the right place? But ultimately, you've got to look at the overall production impacts. Can you generate more revenue because you have less health challenges? Think about those associated factors with profitability that we talked about early on. They're generally health-related factors. If we can improve those, how much can we drive profitability? With that, I thank you for the opportunity to be here, and we'll pass it back to the layman team.
Welcome back to this session on batch farrowing. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for your excellent summary of the challenges in front of us. Taking us down into more detail is Dr. Joseph Thomas. Dr. Thomas is currently at the Iowa State Veterinary Diagnostic Lab, but previously he was with the Audubon Manning Veterinary Clinic and has worked extensively on the subject of initiating batch farrowing and refining batch farrowing within clients' farms. And his presentation is entitled, My Experience with Managing Health and Production in Batch Farrowing Farms. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Thomas.
Thanks for having me. Okay, so as previously mentioned, I used to work with AMVC, and with them I was in both a health and production role, and I'm currently at the Iowa State Diagnostic Lab becoming a diagnostician. So probably when talking about production schemes, it's easiest to talk about them on a continuum, with continuous production being at one end, and at least for the uses of this presentation, or defining that as a production scheme where you have more than one wean event in a week. So if you're doing a Monday, Thursday wean, or a Monday, Wednesday, Friday wean, or even if you're weaning 7 days a week. And in this type of production scheme, you're able to wean greater than 25% of your farrowing crates in a week. So you can turn your whole farrowing house in 3.x weeks, less than 4 weeks, which gives you slightly younger wean age, but a tighter distribution of wean age, and allows you to maximize your throughput on your farrowing crates. Sort of next down the list in that continuum would be something you could call a 21 batch. This is essentially continuous production. So here we're kind of describing it as having one wean event in a week. So a lot of people have a Thursday wean, at which time you're weaning a quarter of your farrowing crates. So in this type of system, you'd be turning your farrowing house once every 4 weeks and producing roughly a 21-day-old pig. After that would be 10-2 production, where you have a wean event where you're weaning half your crates every 2 weeks. So you still turn your farrowing house and wean the same age pig, but you're doing it essentially in 2 groups. I've seen this in practice in some farrow to finish guys that are still holding on. It allows them to kind of even out the labor side of things that some of the more extreme batch systems can get a little bit cyclical in. Then 5-4 production would be essentially weaning your entire farrowing house once every 4 weeks. You still are turning your farrowing house again, in the same time frame as you were with the 10-2 or the 21 batch, same age wean pig. And then all the way at the other end of the spectrum would be a 4-5 batch. So here you are, again, weaning 100% of your farrowing house at a time, but you're doing it once every 5 weeks, and in doing so, you're picking up an extra day of wean age. So you can see kind of those 3 in the middle are roughly the same from a production standpoint. You're turning your house every 4 weeks, you're weaning the same age pig. The continuous production, you can wean a slightly younger pig and turn your farrowing house a little bit quicker, which should allow you to maximize production, and that's probably why that's how most people do things. And then that 4-5 batch on the end, you're sacrificing 20% of your potential production by only weaning every 5 weeks. So if you were going to do that, you would need to put a pretty high premium on wean age. My personal experience is mostly with the 5-4 production. So for the purposes of this presentation, that's really what I'm going to focus on. Specifically in this presentation, I'll kind of break it out into 3 areas. The first being space and setting targets. The second being scheduling / event chain methodology and how to arrange that. And then the third just being logistics. And I'll try to talk about these things just as practically as I can. Okay, so for a 5-4 batch scheme, you essentially have 5 cohorts of reproductive females on the farm. You're going to end up with 1 cohort of suckling pigs at any given time. And so you're kind of practicing all in, all out farrowing, as opposed to, with continuous production, it's almost like a continuous flow nursery in your farrowing house. And that gives you the opportunity to break disease cycles. One of the downsides of this is you are locked into that 4-week turn. So a lot of people perceive this as, hey, it's going to be hard for me to compete with a continuous production scheme if I'm turning my farrowing house every 4 weeks on the dot. And one way that people have used to get around this would be sort of overbreeding and then burning sows to try to maximize the amount of piglets produced per unit of fixed cost. So I said burning sows, which is kind of a slang term. So essentially, if you have X number of farrowing crates, you're going to overbreed so that you have extra sows to farrow waiting in the G barn. Obviously, those should be the sows with the last 114 day, those that are going to be the last to go in that cohort. Then, inevitably you're going to have some sow death in the farrowing house, or you're going to have sows with just a few born alive piglets, or somebody that's a poor milker. And the idea is with those sows that are not as productive or have died, you're going to go ahead and cross foster the pigs, kick them out, and then quickly load in a sow from your extras out in the G barn. And so it works kind of well to make, I don't know, what we would call like a reverse parking lot. With a batch style production, you only have 4 cohorts of pigs in the G barn at any given time. So you really don't have a need for a parking lot to do your back tightening. But what you can do is take those extras that you have out of each group, stage them in such a way that they're in one spot within the barn, and it's easy for you to get them moved into the farrowing house quickly. One thing I do want to say with this is that you need to be pretty aggressive on making those calls early on in farrowing. It's pretty easy for this to devolve into sows just farrowing out in the G barn and grabbing the piglets off of them, which is really going to kick up your pre-wean mortality, and it's not the idea at all with this plan. Okay, so then as far as kind of figuring out your space and setting your targets off of that, so we talked about overbreeding so we could burn sows. In this example, We're assuming we want to farrow 5% more sows than we have farrowing crates. So to figure out our breed target, we're saying a number of farrowing crates times 1.05, and then we're going to divide that by our expected farrowing rate. So say we've got a farm with 483 farrowing crates, and we think we're going to have an 85% farrowing rate. We're going to end up with about 596 breeds to try to farrow about 507 sows. And so you can see with that, if we're trying to, we're going to end up with roughly 20, 25 extra sows that we're trying to burn and get moved into there. Then again, below that, we have an assumed goal of a 55% annual replacement rate. And so if it takes you, in a 5-4 batch, 20 weeks to turn all 5 groups, you can see that, 55%, divide that by your 2.6 turns in a year. You essentially want 21% roughly of your breeds to be gilt breeds. And so in this example, 596 breeds, we're looking at about 125 of those need to be gilts. And one thing I want to point out here, since the formula is up there, is that space a lot of times is an issue when it comes to batch farrowing. And it's pretty easy to tell here that the easiest way to fix space problems is to improve your farrowing rate. If that's an 80% farrowing rate, I'm breeding a lot more sows to hit my, farrowing target. And, all of a sudden my 5 cohorts become quite a bit bigger, and it gets to be a lot harder to make those wean days work. So then in terms of talking about space, I think it's easiest to talk about a gestation to farrowing space ratio. It lets you compare different size farms, different, style of farms, and still sort of have a common language. So this will have a big impact on how your wean event will flow, how many days it needs to be scheduled over. So really the size of the hole that you have in your snake in the G barn kind of determines how many of those sows you're going to be able to turn out of the farrowing house, and essentially how quickly that flip-flop can happen and how quickly you can get through that wean day, which might not seem like a big deal if you're used to continuous production, but if you're trying to wean your entire farrowing house in one day, those wean events are pretty hectic, and it really does make quite a bit of difference. Generally, this ratio sits at about 5 or 6 to 1 on most farms, the way they're set up. I would say the closer it is to 6 to 1, the easier that wean day is going to be. Obviously, that's a lot higher ratio, or that higher ratio means a lot higher facility cost per pig. On the other hand, if you're designing a farm and you sort of push it closer to that 6 to 1, you're going to make those wean days easier on your staff, and it likely is going to reduce turnover. Okay, so just kind of for an example here, this is a schematic of a farm. You can see crated gestation here. There's a couple of barns with pen gestation, and then this is your farrowing house. And these are a couple of GDUs that we can ignore. But on this farm, we have roughly 2,500 to 500 gestation spaces to farrowing spaces, which works out to about 5.3 to 1. So I can just tell you with that ratio, if you're sitting at like an 88% farrowing rate, you're only going to have, and you're bringing gilts in and sending calls out with each batch, you're only going to have about, if things are going well, maybe 140 empty spaces in the G barn. So pretty quickly you could see, well, that's, about a quarter of your farrowing spaces. So how do you want to make your wean event work? In this case, it's going to take 4, you can call them flip-flops or whatever you want, but 4 events of weaning the sows, taking them out to gestation, washing the farrowing house, and then reloading farrowing to get through this all. So likely something like that. Maybe this is the kind of thing you want to schedule across a couple of days. And then even within one day, you may be weaning half the sows for that day or the first quarter of your overall farrowing house, washing the farrowing crates, and then loading that many sows back into the farrowing house. And then you do that all over again. So when we're talking about scheduling and how we're going to map this all out, I think the first thing you got to do is figure out what you're going to make your dominant event. So really, you're locked into a standard gestation length, pretty standard lactation length, and then your wean sows are going to stand X number of days after they're weaned, and that's just sort of the way it is. So you can set this up any number of ways. I think it's easiest just to make the wean day the dominant repeating event, and then schedule all their events sort of conditional off of that. So like we were just talking about, looking at that schematic, we need to define our wean event, kind of based off labor availability, what our customer wants, and sort of what our transportation logistics are going to be. It's pretty hard to pull off a batch wean in one day. And so if you're going to break that out across multiple days, is that going to be 2 or 3? Are they going to be consecutive or not? Are you going to do like a Friday, Monday wean, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that sort of thing? But that's probably the first thing you have to figure out, knowing what your space limitations are. Set your wean event, and then, so depending on those decisions that you make, it's going to impact what your breed window is, and then also ultimately your wean age distribution. And then you got to choose a scheduling modality that works for you. Gantt charts are nice. I think they're used a lot in the construction world. They're pretty good if you want to make events conditional on other events, so that editing that dominant event will change everything along with it. I like to use Google Calendars. I think they're a little easier on the eye. And I think they work pretty well for making repeating events. Otherwise, you could just use Excel or Outlook. Okay, so pictured here would be typical Google Calendar that I would use. And so for this example, we're saying the wean event is going to be 2 consecutive days set on a Friday, Saturday. And then that's a repeating event every 4 weeks. And then using that, we can say our breed window starts on the day of the wean event and has an 8-day duration. So in this case, it's Friday through the following Friday. And then your heaviest breeding period is really going to be when your wean sows stand, which is about 4 to 6 days after you wean. And so that's pictured here in dark green. So that's our breed window. What we can do is set up an H&S window after that, where we heat no service any girl that stands for the next 7 days. And what you can see off of this is if we H&S from, say, this Friday to this, or from this Saturday to this Friday, they're going to go ahead and stand 3 weeks later in our next breed window really well. And then following that H&S window would be a matrix window, where anybody that we haven't recorded an H&S on, didn't stand in the previous breed window, would receive matrix. So here we have a 10-day matrix window starting the day after our H&S window ends, and then going through to about 4 days prior to our next breed window. So that's only 10-day duration as opposed to the 14-day duration that you generally think about with matrix. The idea here is that those pigs will tend to stand 4 to 9 days after you pull that matrix. And so if I pull it here, I'm going to get those girls to stand right here at the beginning of my breed window. As opposed to if I go the full 14 days, yes, they're going to go ahead and stand in that breed window, but it'll be towards the back end of it. And I'm going to sacrifice wean age if I do that. Now, granted, the cost of that is anybody who is naturally going to stand in these 3 days, we're going to miss. So it's sort of a give and take, but we generally say it's worth it to pick up that wean age. One other thing I want to point out is you will have a couple of girls stand those first 2 days that you give matrix. They are probably already locked in to come into heat those days, and 1 day of matrix isn't going to change that. It's not a big deal. You won't get those then in this batch, but they will naturally fall to 3 days later in the next H&S window, and then fall into the next batch. Okay, so that kind of talks about our, what we have set up for like a breeding strategy based off that wean event. Then with that in place, our farrowing window ends up being, or we can calculate it's like 112 days from the start of our previous breed window to 117 days from the end of that previous breed window. And so what you see is that falls nicely. The day we move those sows in is the first day they would potentially farrow. And that runs through, 13 days till right here about, 17 days prior to our last wean day. Our heaviest farrowing is going to occur, 114 to 116 days off of when our heavy breeding occurred. And then we just are picturing a processing window here, just setting the rule as our farrowing window plus 2 days. With heavy processing being that same rule, just set off of the heavy farrowing window. All right, so right here you can see off this scheduling scheme, we have 2 really busy weeks and then 2 very slow weeks. And that will tend to be the case in a 5-4 batch. But the nice thing about that is you can sort of see when your slower times are and schedule in the things that tend to fall by the wayside, on a lot of farms as people get busy. So for example, say you're going to do a 5 and 7 week preg check, you can do it by batch and just have it set in there. Here we have it every other Wednesday. So they just know, hey, on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, I preg check 1 batch. Easy enough. The other thing would be figuring out how your gilts are going to come into here. So if you figure your gilts are going to stand, assuming they haven't cycled, maybe 3 to 5 days, 4 to 5 days after you bring them in to the farm and expose them to a boar, it would be nice if you could do it in such a way that you didn't have to use matrix to get them to fall into a batch. So here's the start of our H&S window. If we bring these gilts in, say the Tuesday prior, then 1, 2, 3, 4 days later, they should stand nicely into our H&S window. And then we get our first heat no serve on them. They stand 3 weeks later, that falls right into a breed window, which works out well for us. And you can just set that up as a repeating event every 4 weeks. We know we always bring them in here on this Tuesday to get them to stand here, record an H&S, and then they fall into our breed window. We don't have to give most of them any matrix. And so, for me, if I'm going to record that's an event here in my calendar, then it works well to say, hey, if I'm doing any sort of surveillance in the GDU prior to bringing gilts in, why don't we go ahead and set that up the week prior? Maybe give ourselves enough time that if something is positive and we need to sequence it or collect more samples, we have the time to do that. And they know, hey, I bring in gilts next week. Maybe your farm staff, if they're collecting the blood or the oral fluid or whatever, they always know that I got to do that the Tuesday prior. And it's just something that's sort of locked into their mind that they always have to take care of. You could also, take advantage of the fact that you have 2 slower weeks to program your pre-farrow and pre-breed vaccines by batch into these spaces. So, here we're saying, okay, we're going to give RCE roughly 2 weeks pre-farrow and parvolepto erie 1 week pre-farrow. And maybe they just know then, hey, every, the 2 Mondays in my slower weeks are when I shoot vaccine. And so it's not something that sort of gets forgotten or gets, overlooked. Same thing could be said for feed orders. You have this schedule set up. Maybe you want them, if you're using a toll mill, maybe you want Monday, Thursday delivery scheme. And so easy enough program in here, hey, we want you to have that feed order in by 9 a.m. 2 days prior, whatever else. Or if you're going to have, a weekly meeting with the production team, or at least, a 15-minute call at the start of the week, now you've got one spot where you know exactly what's going to happen for that week. Okay, yep, hey, we got a wean event on Friday. Don't forget, to get your feed order in before you get busy with the wean. Or, hey, we've got gilts coming in on Tuesday. Make sure you have everything set up. Everybody can kind of look at this calendar and be speaking the same language and looking at the same events that are, kind of set up to occur during that week. Okay. So with that schedule set up, it would result in roughly a 17 to 27 day wean age range would make sense, right? About 10, 11 days, with the mean falling right between 20 and 21 days. And so again, we said, your wean sows are kind of locked to stand in 4 to 6 days after a weaning event. That's just what they're going to do. So if you want to try to pick up some wean age, sinking your gilts or your op sows into that first part of that breed window. So, if we're essentially, let's go here. If this is our breed window, we know this period is when our wean sows are going to stand. If I pull my matrix here, I can get those op sows to stand here. If I bring my gilts in here and they're going to stand right here at the beginning of the breed window, or I'm sorry, if I bring them in here and they're going to stand right here at the beginning of that H&S window, same thing. Then they're going to stand at the start of the breed window in the next batch. And doing those things will help you pick up your average wean age a little bit. Okay, so we talked about kind of space and setting goals off that, and we talked about scheduling, and then we're going to talk about just some basic logistics. So probably easiest to think inputs, process, and outputs. So for inputs, feed, propane or natural gas, gilts, semen, water, electricity, your consumable supply items. Then your labor, transportation, data management in terms of a process, and then your outputs, wean pigs, manure, coal sows, that kind of thing. And so essentially what we're doing is kind of compressing our consumption of those inputs from 4 weeks into a 1 week roughly period, and the same thing with the outputs on the other end. So in terms of feed, what this looks like, gestation consumption or gestation ration consumption remains relatively constant in the G barn. However, your lactation consumption becomes pretty cyclical. So, you got every girl in the farrowing house now is at the same day of lactation. They're not all spread out like they would be in a continuous system. And so if they're ramping up from, 4.5 pounds a day up to as much as 25 or even more pounds per day by the end of lactation, you can pretty quickly see, looking at that whole farrowing house, you're going from 8 tons per week to 42 tons per week being consumed. So it's just important to have a really good handle on what your lactation bin capacity is if you're going to go to batch production. And you might need to schedule an extra truck in late lactation to deliver more of that ration. Just also to have a good idea, hey, I'm heading there. This, I'm going to have a wean event coming up here in a week. I should be on the lookout for an out of feed event in the farrowing house. All right, and then as far as gilts go, probably just easiest to work through an example. So say I'm purchasing 50-pound gilts, assuming they're like 9 or 10 weeks old. And I'm thinking that, hey, if I'm purchasing 50-pound pigs, I should be able to get 80 to 85% of those bred successfully, which is pretty conservative. So our prior example of a gilt target, we say we had 125. So we use 0.83 right there in the middle. I want to bring in about 150 of those gilts for each batch. Could bring in 2 batches at a time. So 300 gilts, that's 1 trailer's worth. And do that every 8 weeks if I'm set up on a 4-week batch turn. So if they do 16 weeks in the GDU and we bring in half of those at a time into the sow farm, essentially what we'd end up with is first half come in at 25 weeks. They stand in that H&S window, and then by the time they're breed eligible, they're right about 28 weeks of age. And the second half would come in about 28 weeks of age, stand in that H&S window, and then be breed eligible at about 32 weeks of age. And so, if space is not an issue, you could bring in 2 batches worth of gilts at the same time and not have the split in the age. However, I would say, it's rare that that's going to be the case. And so, getting your farrowing rate in order will help you create some space. On the other hand, just going to bring those gilts in every 4 weeks will do the same thing. It'll create a little bit of space in your G barn. As far as semen goes, I think the biggest thing is making sure that it's feasible for your boar stud to provide what would essentially have been 4 weeks worth of semen into your, 10-day breed window. One thing you could do to kind of help that, if you're converting multiple farms to batch, you can just offset those wean events by week. So if this is the wean week for this one, maybe, I've got 4 farms, say, and I just set 1 wean event for each of those 4 weeks. So that might help even out your semen consumption a little bit. And then beyond that, you could do the same thing by day of the week. If I'm setting up this farm to be a Friday, Saturday wean, maybe my other batch farm I'm going to set up to be a Monday, Tuesday wean. And then I wouldn't overlook making sure that you have enough capacity to hold semen on the farm. Just because you had enough capacity when you were set up in a continuous production scheme doesn't mean you're going to have what you need if you switch to batch production. So, if you're going to breed 600 sows, you need, maybe 2 doses, so 1,200 doses. And you got to and then figure out how you're going to have that order set up for those 1,200 doses across the breed window, and how much you're ever going to have on hand at any given time, and then figure out what you're going to need for cooler space off of that. But I wouldn't overlook it, otherwise you can end up in a jam. All right. And then as far as electricity consumption goes, again, it remains relatively consistent in the G barn. However, in the farrowing house, I would say it's important to look at what your strategy is for creating a microenvironment for those piglets. Are you using heat mats versus heat lamps? And then if you're doing that, are you going to create a temp curve and vary voltage across lactation? If you are, and you're switching to batch production, you're going to end up with kind of a cyclical pattern of, demand for electricity, with, the highest being early lactation when you have those heat mats set to 90 degrees or your heat lamps turned all the way up. And so not maybe so much an issue from a can you get electricity standpoint, but maybe knowing what is your breaker capacity and do you have adequate wiring to do this? If it may have been okay when you were in continuous production, but then once you have the entire farrowing house starting out at the top of that curve and demanding that electricity, you might start tripping breakers and chilling pigs and then causing a scour in the farrowing house. So just having a good handle on that. And probably one of the biggest things to think about would be water. So knowing what the source is for your farm, is it well water or are you on rural water? And then figuring out what your maximum flow rate is, which, you can do it at the main yourself with just a 55-gallon drum and a stopwatch. Or you can pay somebody to do it. Then, so your consumption is going to be highest during that wean event when you're pressure washing the entire farrowing house. So you got to get a good handle on, all right, how many pressure washers are you going to run on those wean days? What is the flow rate on those pressure washers? And then, knowing what your flow rate is at the main, do you have the capacity to meet those? And do you have the capacity to meet those if it's August and all your cool cells are running at the same time? And then if you don't, which you very likely may not, I would say the easiest way to work around that would be just creating some on-site storage for water as opposed to doing something to try to increase the flow rate yourself. So you could set up some indoor, water storage tanks and have those filling 24/7. So then when it's time to do the wean event, you have plenty of water on hand to get through that pressure washing. Okay, and then supply items. So just kind of talking about consumables, things like injectable iron, AI rods, stuff like that. I would say one thing I ran into is that it is harder for farm managers to keep a handle and be a good judge of what they have on hand and what they expect to go through, because their consumption of those items gets to be so cyclical. Maybe it looks like they've got plenty of AI rods on hand, but they're going to go through 1,200, in one breed period, for that previous example we used. And so maybe it's a little harder for them to judge that. So one thing I did to kind of work around this was, first determine exactly what it is that we want to keep on hand on the farm, and that's kind of up to you, but maybe say you want to have enough of these items to get through 2 batches worth of production. And so then if I want to have enough to get through 2 batches, then it's easy enough. Figure out exactly how many AI rods I need to do that, how much iron I need, exceed, scalpels, needles, whatever vaccines I'm going to use, maybe extra pressure washer nozzles to get through all that pressure washing, compressed CO2, whatever it is. Figure out what you want to have on hand, have that pretty well defined, and then you can create a list for that farm manager just to make their life that much easier. Then you have that schedule made up, you have these 2 slower weeks, you can just schedule in an inventory day where they take that list and they go reconcile it with their inventory and say, hey, I need to order this much of X and this much of Y to keep the standing inventory that I'm supposed to have on hand. And then again, I use the example of 2 batches worth on hand at all times. It's up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. Obviously that might be tying up more capital and inventory than you want. On the other hand, you're less likely to have, any sort of emergency where, holy crap, I've got 300 sows standing in heat and I'm all of a sudden out of AI rods. Okay. And as far as labor, I would say a good rule of thumb would be 1 person for every 250 to 300 sows, counting the manager. And we keep mentioning this, you have 2 very busy weeks and 2 very slow weeks. So to best utilize the labor that you have on hand, there's a couple, you could essentially have standing crews at farms and then maybe utilize a floating crew that jumps between 2 batch farms on those 2 busier weeks. So that you're not wasting, time or money there. The other thing is, you can kind of schedule your maintenance or sanitation projects or whatever else you have going on during those slow weeks to go ahead and keep people busy. And honestly, during those busy weeks, they're going to be working a lot more than a 45-hour work week. And so, if they're comfortable with it, they can be scheduled for maybe 60 hours during those busy weeks and 30 hours during the slow weeks. There's nothing saying that it needs to be, constant all the time. One thing I found was that, you're so locked into this 28-day batch turn. That's like, you kind of live and die by it in that production scheme. And so there's no reason you can't embrace that and make your personnel schedule entirely based off the 28-day turn. And so maybe, rather than a monthly schedule, you come out with the batch schedule for who is working. So example, hey, everybody's going to get 6 days off in a turn. They're going to get 1 day off during those 2 busier weeks, and then everybody will get 2 days off during the 2 slower weeks. And maybe if you're relying on, TN visa labor or whatever else where weekends aren't as important, that might allow you to kind of stagger out people's days off so that, you can kind of keep a pretty steady workforce on hand at all times. And, then you're not ending up with really crazy busy days where you're down 2-3 people just because your personnel schedule is not matching that batch schedule. So transportation. So we kind of talked about this with the semen issue and bore studs. But if you have multiple farms converting to batch, offsetting the weeks that they have their wean event on is also going to help you out, sort of smooth out your demands for transportation. One thing I will say that's nice about batch is, if you're only weaning once every 4 weeks, that's fewer times you have a trailer backing up to your farm. So there's probably a decreased biosecurity risk from that standpoint. Also, for the customer receiving these pigs, it's fewer fills into that barn, which should hopefully decrease the risk on their end as well. And then I would say, we talked about how are you going to set up your wean event? Is it 1 day, 2 days? Are they consecutive? Not. But then thinking about how does that look from a time frame standpoint? Are all those pigs going to be ready to go on a trailer right first thing in the morning? Or is it going to be the kind of thing where the first half are ready to go, bright and early, and then you have to do that sort of wean wash load flip flop, and then the second half are ready about noon? And so how does that look for the types of trailers, that you want to use? If you're weaning 5,000 pigs, do you want to use, 4 double deckers, having, 2 come the first day of the wean, 2 come the second day of the wean, or can you get away with 2 quads? And then also thinking about in terms of that is maybe one trailer type a little riskier from a biosecurity standpoint, just in terms of how easy it is to clean. Well, as far as data management goes, so one nice thing about batch production is you only have 5 cohorts of sows on the farm, and you have very distinct spaced out farrowing and wean events. So it makes it a little easier to correct data collection issues or, missing female issues. You essentially, the manager on the farm can just run an overdue to farrow or overdue to wean report a couple days after those events happen and figure out what they have for data entry mistakes well before they get a set of corrections that they have to go back in and figure out. Now it's been 3 weeks and who knows where these girls are. The other nice thing is just kind of find out is, if you have a sow that loses her card or loses her ear tag or gets out, if you only have, 5 cohorts of sows, one of who's in farrowing, you can pretty easily figure out what group she belongs to with an ultrasound, which, that's a lot harder to do if you're in continuous production. All right. Then outputs. So from a manure standpoint, probably the big thing to focus on is getting a good handle on what the capacity is for your farrowing pits and how many batches worth of manure and water can they hold. So I would say the big thing here is the amount of water that you're going to put into those when you pressure wash that house all at once. And, you want to make sure that you have enough capacity prior to the wean event that when you put all that water in the pit, you're not going to immediately be overflowing into the alleyways. So something that worked well for us would be, if you have a wean event set up on, say, Friday, Saturday, you can pull the plugs 1 to 2 days prior to that. You should have plenty of water built up from the previous wean event. And, all that is produced from sow urine and everything else, over the last 4 weeks. So go ahead and flush those lines and not get things clogged up. And then, you're only sitting there with an empty pit for maybe 24 or 48 hours. And then you have a wean event and you're immediately putting water over the top of that and creating a water seal to sort of mitigate some of those odor issues. And then wean pigs. So in the farrowing house, we kind of talked about this, but it's essentially all in, all out farrowing. And it gives you a chance to break a scour cycle, every 4 weeks. So as opposed to kind of always fighting a lingering scour in your, week-old pigs or whatever it is, it's like you get a fresh start every time you have a wean. The other thing I would say is sort of, and it's anecdotal, but it seems that, I don't know, I've noticed walking into continuous production farms, you get into those pigs that are getting closer up to being weaned, and you start to notice more coughing and maybe more swollen joints and things like that. We tend to chalk that up to strep and influenza. But it seems like when you go into the farrowing house on some of these batch farms, you just don't notice as much of a cough. And I don't know, can't exactly explain why that is, but anyway, for what it's worth. And then, so wean age, we talked about, your wean age distribution is going to be wider for that wean group. However, when you look at the time it takes to fill, say, a wean to finish barn, obviously you're gonna fill it in 1 or maybe 2 fills, and so you're looking at, so yeah, maybe for that wean group you have a wider age distribution, but for the customer, for that wean to finish barn, you have a tighter wean age distribution, and you have fewer fills, so you have a decreased biosecurity risk from that standpoint, and then you have a shorter period where you keep introducing the next wean of animals as you fill that barn and kind of setting up some of that host organism environment instability for some of our endemic bugs. Okay, so again, just to summarize, I kind of talked about space and target setting, or setting targets, and then scheduling / event chain methodology and logistics for 5-4 batch production. And that's all I've got, so I'll give it back to you.
Thanks very much for this detailed presentation, Dr. Thomas. It shows you've had a great deal of experience through working through many of the challenges and opportunities with this technology. For my next introduction, we have Dr. Trey Kellner from the AMVC Management Services Group. Dr. Kellner is a nutritionist who has worked extensively with the group and has also taken up the challenge of working through batch farrowing systems and identifying methods to refine nutritional programs. And his presentation is entitled Feeding Program Considerations When Converting to a Batch Farrowing System. Thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Kellner.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, Dr. Dean, and it's a pleasure to be speaking here at this online Lehman conference. Wish I could be with you up in Minnesota, but this will just have to do for this year. I will share my email address. It's tkellner@amvcms.com at the end of this presentation. For those of you who are watching this as part of this virtual conference, feel free to shoot me an email if you have a question about this. So Dr. Johnson and Dr. Thomas did an outstanding job of really outlining the advantages to a batch farrow system and what they all may entail, whether that's how to convert the calendar and what all that you should consider if you're going to switch from a continuous system to a batch farrow system. So what this presentation instead is really going to focus on is once you've made the decision, how do you best feed those sows and gilts, those piglets? And then once you wean those pigs into a wean to finish system, how do we best feed those? So my action items from this presentation, I always think it's effective to provide what you want your audience to get from this presentation. So there's really three key takeaways here. The first is to start or continue to understand what your wean age is and how do you best feed pigs that are based on that age, right? So whether you're in a continuous system or a batch farrowed system, different wean ages in those pigs will have different enzyme machinery and they will break down feedstuffs and digest and absorb those differently depending on how old they are. So whether you're in a continuous system or a batch farrowed system, understanding whether you have a subset of 15-day-old pigs or if they're all 21 days and older is important on how you best transition them onto a solid base feed once they're weaned. The second key action item is to start or to continue to understand how you place groups of pigs on feed, right? So having advantages of a single fill or having one age of pigs be placed in one group and on one feed line. And then the third action item is to increase the accuracy of your sow farm feed usage, regardless if you're on a continuous or a batch farrowed system. So my objectives are the first to explain to consider in your feeding program when you've made the decision to convert to a batch farrowed system. And I want to highlight three specific lessons that we've learned from. The first is how do you best feed your gilts and sows during the conversion? Then how do you feed gilts and sows post the conversion? And then what are the post-weaning advantages and disadvantages within your feeding program once you've converted to a batch farrowed system? So I guess why the conference committee asked me to speak, and Dr. Thomas alluded to this when he was with the AMVC team, is we converted all our West Central Iowa sow farms and finishing flows to be set up for a single fill for 2,400 head barns in 2018 and 2019. To do so, this was about transitioning about 30,000 sows that we converted from a continuous system to a 4-week batch farrowed system, which Dr. Thomas did an outstanding job of outlining in the prior presentation. And basically, it was an opportunity to share our learnings what we learned as a nutritionist and what we were able to leverage with our batch farrowed system within our feeding program. So as Dr. Thomas and Dr. Johnson alluded to, right, the motivation of converting to batch farrowing is really to shorten the negative impact time of viral pathogens by removing that young animal host every 4 weeks in terms of an all-in, all-out within your lactation rooms. However, with converting to batch farrowing, there are several other advantages at all stages of production, and I will try to outline those for you throughout this presentation. So one term that I've used so far in this presentation and will use throughout the remainder of this presentation is the term a feeding program, right? And basically when I'm talking about a feeding program, I'm talking about everything that encompasses nutrition, right? So that includes our inputs, such as the pig requirements, ingredients, logistics, performance objectives, our packer requirements, and any environmental requirements that we may have to meet, right? And then our outputs, our diet formulations and our budgets, our feeding management and protocols, and that all leads to financial performance or our return over investment projections. So feeding program, if I use that term broadly, it's really talking about both our inputs and outputs, everything from what we need to do logistically all the way to our diets and protocols. So Dr. Thomas really did a great job of breaking down what a 5-breed group, 4-week batch looks like in terms of our calendar. So how I want to outline this and use this information is basically understanding of once we've decided to convert to batch farrowing, how do we best feed those gilts and sows that are currently being converted within our sow farms, right? And then this is just an example that Dr. Thomas went through very well in terms of once we've converted. So I will skip over this for sake of time, right? So this is basically an example of how we would feed our gestating sows. So let me briefly set up this slide. On our y-axis is the SID lysine intake requirements on a grams per day basis. So on our x-axis, or the horizontal axis, is the days of gestation. So that light blue line that you see that's curved similar to a roller coaster, that would actually be our lysine requirement over the 115-day gestational period. And then you'll see 3 different lines. You'll see a blue line, a red line, and a green line. Now let me start with the red line. The red line is what we formulate our gestation diet for, and that's what we feed our ideal condition sows. So we use the sow caliper that Dr. Knauer developed at North Carolina State. And based on our caliper score, we then feed to individual condition, or if they're in a pin house system, we feed to the pin condition. So as you see, if they're in ideal condition, or if the individual sow's in ideal condition, we formulate to a level that's above that peak lysine requirement at 115 days. As you see there, we'll have a thin condition sow line. So if the caliper thin, we'll feed them more, an additional pound or greater. And then if they're heavy conditioned, of course, we'll feed them less, usually a pound less from base. So where I really want to use this infographic is, as Dr. Thomas alluded to, as you're converting over to a batch farrow system, there may be sows that in gilts that don't particularly hit a breed window, right? So a breed window is usually about 7 to 10 days, depending on what parameters you want to set for that batch. So in terms of when sows naturally stand, or maybe you gave a matrix, but for whatever reason, biology overrode that and they didn't come into heat within that breed window, and they continually to be within your breed pool, but they're not bred yet. So what are you actually feeding those sows is very important, right? So in a continuous system, as soon as they're weaned, they usually go on full feed, or maybe 6 pounds or 8 pounds per day until they're bred. So if we're converting those over to a batch farrowed system, they may set up to 21 days or 42 days or even greater within that same area. So it's very important that when you're switching to batch farrowing, don't just leave those sows on full feed, or don't just give them 6 pounds or 8 pounds as you would normally do in a continuous system when you expect to breed them 5 days after they wean, right? There's going to be some adjustment period there. So it's very important that when you're converting to a batch farrow systems that you're feeding sows to condition. So what we outlined is we caliper sows as soon as they were weaned. Sometimes we actually did it in the farrowing crates before they were weaned, the day before they were weaned. And basically we use a color system to mark those, right? We use green if they're thin, we use red if they're ideal, and we use blue if they're heavy, right? And based off of those scores, right, we need to feed them to condition, especially if they're going to be held for 21 or maybe 42 days before they're actually bred to go within now their new breed group. So it's very important to manage feed usage during this conversion, or you can end up with some really heavy conditioned sows and some very inflated feed costs, right? So typically pounded gestation feed is 10 to 11 cents per day. So if our base is 4 pounds, but instead those sows that are waiting to hit their breed window are consuming 8 pounds, right? We're doubling our on-farm feed cost for those sows from 44 cents a day to 88 cents a day. And that, basically $0.50 increase can really accumulate over this 20-some week period as you're converting a farm from a continuous farrowed system to a batch farrow system. So that's a lesson that we learned early in our conversion, is that we can't just let our sows go. We need to feed them to what their actual condition is to limit our on-farm feed costs. Second of all, on our gilts, right, as Dr. Thomas alluded to, maybe the gilts that are within your ISO barn that you brought in may not particularly hit your breed window as needed in terms of the numbers that you need to hit that breed target, or when they actually stand, right? So you're better off tweaking those GDU diets throughout their growing period versus than just using a more extreme holding diet prior to them being bred, right? So if you know that you need gilts on week 21, but they're going to hit, let's just say 330 pounds by week 18, well, if it's week 1 and you've already done that math and know that those gilts are going to be too big prior to that breed target or that breed date window, then you're better off just limiting average daily gain a bit throughout those 20 weeks than you are waiting to say till week 15 and then putting them on a high soy whole diet, trying to limit their size and their weight, and then trying to have them cycle and them actually being able to breed, right? So your conception rate, your ability to detect estrus, your ability to have a high farrowing rate will be way better off if you tweak GDU diets way prior to when you actually want them bred versus than using an extreme holding diet for 21 days prior to them being bred. Furthermore, when you're converting and after you've converted, it's important to coach this that all your feeding protocols will now be done every 4 weeks and quadrupled in time spent, right? So we do have a strict pre-farrow feeding protocol in where we found that we can reduce our stillborn rate by 3% by feeding 2 pounds twice a day, first thing in the morning and last thing before the crew goes home, to sows once they are loaded until they farrow. So now instead of doing this protocol every day, now you're only going to do it for 7 to 10 days every 4 weeks. And furthermore, instead of just doing that pre-farrow hand feeding every day and maybe spending 45 minutes on it, well, now once that entire batch is loaded, you may spend 2 to 3 hours feeding every sow within every farrowing crate, right? Because you've had nothing that's farrowed yet. So it's important to understand that and make sure that you have that protocol coached appropriately, and you also have enough labor assigned to get that accomplished. Furthermore, we also use the sow caliper, as mentioned before, for body condition and for feed intake settings and how we formulate our diets. So once again, you're not going to caliper sows every week. Now you're going to do it every 4 weeks. And furthermore, you're also going to spend, when you're doing that every 4 weeks, you're going to quadruple the time that you're spend doing it, right? So it's important to find those 2 weeks that Dr. Thomas alluded to that we're less busy to do our sow caliper scoring and to set our corresponding feed boxes and to also group our sows together by body condition, right? So I've actually found that it's easier to caliper sows and adjust our feed boxes if needed and to group our sows together better by body condition once we switch to batch farrowing, because now you're only doing it every 4 weeks, so you can plan ahead, right? So if we have a group of sows that's been bred and it's about 35 days, so we're getting ready to move them into our pens, well, we already know how many are thin, how many are ideal, and how many are heavy, right? So then we can pin them together based off their condition and feed them as a pin, versus then kind of a continuous basis where, let's just say you'd only have 7 or 8 pins that were being transitioned every week. Maybe it would be tough to find 2 or 3 pins to put your thins together, or a single pin to put your heavies together. Now that we've basically quadrupled the amount of pins and sows that we have to work with, it's a lot easier to get that done. Furthermore, as Dr. Thomas alluded to, our feed ordering needed to change, right? Our lactation intake is no longer constant, right? We no longer have 3 or 4 farrowing rooms that are always at peak lactation. Instead, we have a 4-week buildup to that peak lactation intake. So all our sows are going to be eating basically 4 pounds a day until they farrow. Then once they start farrowing, they'll go from 4 pounds, maybe clear up to 24 or 30 pounds on a per day basis, right? So that's quite a dramatic increase in feed intake that you'll see over that 21-day period within that lactation batch. So it's very important to coach your feed ordering to stay ahead of that peak lactation intake. Once again, you'll also see the roller coaster come down where you'll have a dramatic decrease in lactation feed usage, right? So you'll go from sows that are consuming almost 30 pounds of feed per day, then you'll wean them, then you'll wash the room and you'll bring bred sows back into those crates that'll only be eating 4 pounds a day then, right? So that's quite the dramatic decrease. So in some cases, as Dr. Thomas alluded to, we needed to increase our on-farm feed storage. So we need to get an extra bulk bin for our lactation rooms. And also, as Dr. Thomas alluded to, in some cases, we needed to adjust how many trucks were coming during that peak lactation intake week, right? So let's just say instead of having, 4 feed deliveries, on a per week basis on a continuous, maybe we only needed to have 3 when we had sows that were just bred and farrowing, and then had 6 as we got to that peak lactation week. Furthermore, within our maternal feeding program considerations is there's very limited options if a sow falls out, and that's at any point in time, right? So if a sow falls out at day 3, day 15, or near weaning, there's very limited options on what you can do. So it's very important for our batch farrow farms to set protocols on what to do if a sow falls out at different time points, right? So if a sow falls out at day 4, what's your protocol? Are you going to euthanize that litter? Are you going to burn that sow, etc.? If it's day 15, what are you going to do? Are you going to pull the divider? Are you going to provide some type of crete feed? What are you going to do there, right? So on the right-hand side example is basically an example of our protocol if a sow falls out past day 14, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to leave that litter together, and we're going to provide what we call a neo pellet, which is high in basically milk-based proteins, so whey, and also is higher in sugar. And then also make sure that you include water, right? So in most farrowing crates, usually there's just a piglet nipple, right, that provides water source to those piglets. But think about if we remove that sow, there's a big loss of water intake and water access that's there, right? What they suckle is a big percentage of that is water, right? So as you see there's a red road Techna feeder on the top part of that picture that's clear, and basically what's in there is water, right? So really think about the water access that you're providing to these piglets if their sow falls out. Furthermore, be really selective when pulling the divider and having one sow potentially nurse 24 piglets. That's the real easy thing to do, and to the naked eye, it looks right to have a suckling source available. But remember that sow is trying to nurse her own 12 piglets now, adding another 12 more. So what you may end up doing, instead of having 12 compromised piglets, you may have 24 compromised piglets, plus the fallout sow that you had, and now the sow that was doing just fine, now she may be compromised because she's not able to eat enough feed to meet this new nutrient demand of trying to nurse 24 piglets, right? So I would say be very selective on when pulling the divider and having one sow nurse multiple litters of piglets. So now I want to transition into what our post-weaning advantages of batch farrowing are, right? So I want to basically talk about the concept of a single fill versus a multiple fill. So these are two barns within our system, and on the left-hand side, we're going to show what would happen if it was a multiple fill or if this was a continuous farrowing scenario. So basically, we're going to have 3 weeks of fill of 800 pigs each, right? So week 1, we have 800 pigs go into the left room. Then we have 400 pigs that are divided across the left room and the right room. And then 3 weeks later, or basically 14 days, past the initial fill, we're going to then top that barn with 800 more pigs. So if we're PRRS positive or flu positive or whatever it may be, we've basically introduced that virus or that bacteria or whatever it may be on a young, vulnerable animal, basically 3 times into that barn, right? However, if we batch this, right, we could do 1 week of 2,400 pigs. Now, as mentioned, we basically do a 4-week system. So as you see, there's only 3 weeks of fill here. So what really happens if we were on a continuous farrowing, we would fill these 2 barns that are on the same site here over 6 weeks, right? So think about in terms of your vaccinations, your gruel feeding, your mat feeding, your zone heating, anything that you need to do to start pigs on feed, having to manage 6 different groups and how basically that's not going to get done right? You're probably going to have to pick an average and go from there. Furthermore, think about our feed budgets, right? So we have a 6-day feed budget followed by a 14-day feed budget, right? As our 2 starter feeds. Well, which set of pigs do we pick to feed to, right? Do we pick the eldest? Do we pick the youngest? Or do we pick the average, right? There's a lot of complications when we have these multiple fill scenarios within our feeding programs and how we manage these pigs to transition them onto feed within our wean to finish system, right? So instead, if we transition the sow farm to batch farrowing and then wean these pigs, right, we can fill basically 1 barn with 2,400 pigs and then have a splash of pigs in barn 2 here on the right. And then 4 weeks later or 5 weeks later, we can then, top the right barn off with 1,600 pigs here. So now we only have 2 groups to deal with, 2 times to vaccinate, 2 times to mat feed, 2 times to worry about our zone heating, etc. So to break this down, what a single fill really gives us in terms of pros versus cons. So pros, first, there's a single entry of pigs into our wean to finish barns, right? So we don't have multiple entries of wean pigs shedding viruses over a 3-week or a 6-week period, as I just showed previously. Second, all pigs are on the correct feed budget and medication protocol, right? So when we're using Mecadox, when we're pulsing with Denegard CTC, when we're transitioning from diet 1 to 2 to 3, we're on the correct time of when those pigs actually need those feed medications. We're on the correct stage of growth for when they need that lysine level or that calcium level or that vitamin level or that energy level, right? That's really important. Now we're not overfeeding or underfeeding pigs because we have different ages within that group. As mentioned before, now we're starting pigs on feed and it's all done at once. This is really important for our growers in terms of their management and their time, especially now that we're starting to get into harvest season. So instead of trying to start pigs for 3 weeks or 6 weeks, and now they can do it over a 1-week period. Pigs are vaccinated all at the same time. Pigs are more of a similar age, and this also helps in terms of our marketing strategy, right? So instead of having those 6 different groups that were across those 2 different barns, now we just have 2 groups. It's a lot easier to to take a first cut, second cut, third cut, and our barn dumps are now more uniform and heavier when we went to a batch farrowed system. And then last, it's easier to have the correct ventilation environment for the correct size of pig, as mentioned before. But there are some cons, and one thing that I'm going to stress here is we do see an increase of number of less than 17-day-old wean pigs, right? So in a batch farrowed system, you're set to a calendar. If it's time to wean them, you can't hold them on like you used to in a continuous system, right? So if you saw that your wean age was slipping, or let's just say you had a particular row of sows and gilts that for whatever reason were either bred late or farrowed late, well, you can just keep them back and wait till the next fill so they're at least 21 days of age. In a batch farrowed system, it is all in and all out, right? That's the definition. So if they're 15 days old, whether we bred them late or they farrowed late or it was a combination of the two, they have to be weaned, they have to go. So we do see an increase of number, how many young pigs we do place on feed. This also means that we have an increased number of small pigs, right? Not only because they're young, but as mentioned before, we have limited options when a sow falls out, right? So they don't have that natural lactation intake and growth that corresponds with that intake as well. So we do see an increased number of small pigs. And then third is we do see a potential shortage of pigs if breed target is missed, right? So in a continuous farrow system, if you miss your breed target by, let's say, 30 or 40 sows, well, you have the opportunity to make it up, you know, on the next weeks of breeds, right? And then maybe you can pull ahead or wean ahead if you need to fill that barn or meet that target. However, when you have 5 breed groups that you breed every 4 weeks, that's no longer available. So if you miss breed target, you're just kind of out of luck. So you don't have any extra breeds or subsequent farrowings that can provide more pigs for the following week and help fill out what you're going to wean. So let me just dive right into the data here and what we actually saw in terms of our advantages when we transitioned from a continuous farrowed system to a batch farrowed system. And we really saw advantages on 2 fronts and 1 disadvantage. First, our disadvantage was in our start weight, right? So as we mentioned, there's the opportunity to have more young pigs and more smaller pigs due to fallout litters. So we did see about a pound decrease in our start weight within this particular data set. What we did see, though, is we saw a tremendous increase in our grade 1 marketing pigs and an improvement in our cull pigs, right? So basically, this was due to improved health status, having more uniform age pigs so we could market them better. Our barn dumps were less light, etc. And then also we saw this nice feed conversion advantage as well. And what that was really from was now we were feeding all those pigs the correct budget, right? So instead of picking, do we feed the youngest pig or the oldest pig or the average pig, all our pigs now within our 2,400 head barns are now of the same age. So we can feed them more precisely and accurately. And basically when we're not overfeeding or underfeeding our pigs due to age, right, we get that improved nutrient utilization and improved feed conversion as well. Right, so I would say the biggest con is how do we handle that subset of under 17-day-old pigs, right? So there's really 5 things that you need to do. First is get a count of how many pigs there will be 2 weeks prior before you wean them, right? Is it 500 pigs that will be below 17 days? Is it none? Is it 100? What is the actual count? Then have the sow farm actually mark these young pigs prior to when they weaned. Within our system, we use blue paint, so they're easily identified on the truck. We also segregate them onto those trucks in separate pens at fill. So when they're weaned, we put them within their own segregated pens so we can provide them, as you see on point 4, more heat, more feeder access, a specialized diet until they reach that 21 day of age or as needed, depending on their size and their corresponding growth. And we'll go into more details on that here in the next couple slides. And then step 5, it's really important, regardless of age of pigs, but especially in these young pigs, to get them up as many times as possible via mat feeding and gruel feeding, right? So we found that the more often you get these pigs up, or the more often you're able to mat feed or gruel feed them or do chores and get these pigs up and into the feeder, the more likely they will succeed into transitioning onto feed, right? So what we do is when we chore our barns, we will do mat feeding and gruel feeding first and then last. So if we have contract growers or our own employees that are only able to get to that particular wean to finish barn twice a day, they at least get 4 mat feedings and gruel feedings and get stirred up 4 times, regardless of what else that we're doing within the barn on that particular day. And that's really important. I can't stress that point enough. So basically what we do is based on the number of pigs that we have in terms of what their age is, whether that's 2,400 or 400, we send out basically care package of feed. So we actually use Previmi's got a stock product that's called NeoPig, and that's basically our young pig diet. So that diet's higher in milk proteins. It's basically is designed to accomplish what the enzyme machinery that young pig possesses. So, you know, those in terms of having lactase enzymes, et cetera, can really break down those feedstuffs and utilize those nutrients better than our 1115 or 1525 that maybe just be a little bit more complex in terms of its nutrient composition, right? So basically we adjust how much feed, whether that's our Neo, our 711, which would be our small pig diet, and then Piranha, which would be our top dress, we send out based on how young they are and then how many pigs that we have. So on the top here is how many bags we'd send out per 2,400 pigs based off their age, and then down below are how many pounds of feed that would be on a per pig basis. So in terms of management and feed presentation, when you have young small pigs is first of all, we use basically wet dry feeders that work really well for market size pigs, but they're not the best feeder in terms of starting a wean pig. And they're even worse when you're starting a young, 7 to 8 pound, 17-day-old pig. So what happens is they'll actually use this pan here. It's basically a hammock, right? They'll defecate in this feeder, they'll urinate in this feeder, etc. So it's really important to keep this feeder closed and to keep it clean to ensure that we're teaching these pigs that, hey, this is where your food source will be one day. So yeah, it's really important to keep that clean and feed presentation adequate and ideal. Furthermore, these pigs are smaller and their intake is less. So oftentimes we'll see that when we mat feed or gruel feed, we'll provide these young subset pigs that are all pinned together the exact same amount that we did to their 24-day-old counterparts that may be in the pen beside them. So what happens is, due to us feeding them the same amount as their older contemporaries, we see this accumulation of this high-priced starter feed just accumulate on these mats, right? So it's important to feed these pigs maybe less when they're first weaned, and then build up their intake as we go. So here's a great example of that, right? Where we're gruel feeding these small young pigs just a small amount, but multiple times a day, and then a small amount of mat feeding so we don't have that accumulation occur. Here's a great example of how we use a smaller nursery type feeder to provide better intake. So in this case, what we've done is we've actually closed off our Crystal Springs feeder, right? So there's no feed or very little feed being in here. So if they do happen to lay in this feeder and defecate in it, we're not wasting very much feed. But what we do have here is a nursery feeder that's more at their level that they can't lay into. So they have basically a fresh feed access provided to them at all times. Another thing to consider is heat, right? So the smaller the animal is and the younger the animal is, the less heat he or she will produce. Furthermore, as we alluded to just before, these younger animals are going to eat less. So the lower the feed intake, also the less heat produced. And if we have them in their own pen, whether that's a large pen here to the left or a smaller pen here to the right, the lower the stocking density and the smaller that pig mass is, the less heat will also be produced. So what we often had here before we converted to batch farrowing is, instead of having 2 brooders as you see here, we'd have 1 brooder that would sit right on top of this gate. And this gate would absorb all this heat, right? So we'd have these small pigs here and a younger subset of pigs over here, and they'd be basically getting half the heat that their other counterparts over here to the right and left would be, when actually they probably need double the amount of heat, right? So it's very important, even in peak summer, to have these brooders be lit and provide the supplemental heating to these small young pigs, because they're smaller in mass, they don't eat very much, and therefore they don't produce a lot of heat. And if they are producing more heat to try to stay alive, well, that means that there's less energy available for them to grow, not only to sustain life, but to put on weight and eventually be a grade 1 or full value pig, which is what we're trying to achieve. So even in peak summer, it's important to provide extra heat. And I would say even look at opportunities to increase the amount of heat that's being provided to the subset of pigs, right? Don't just provide them the same amount of heat that you're providing to the general population. Try to find ways to double the heat that they're actually getting, or the heat access that they need. Right, and then a last reminder to really help your wean to finish feeding program is be dedicated to your breeding window. Do not allow your farms the opportunity to breed a couple sows outside of the breeding window, right? It's only going to result in 13, 14, 15-day-old pigs that are going to increase your feed costs, increase your medicine costs. They're going to very unlikely be grade 1 pigs when you need to dump the barn, right? So really determine what your wean age and your distribution target should be, and follow them, right? And hold those farms accountable, right? So if they're short of breed target, that's okay. It's the lesser of 2 evils than saying, okay, you can breed 30 more sows, right, 2 or 3 days after that breed window is. So all you're going to end up is a bunch of really young pigs. They're really going to struggle throughout the entire wean to finish period. So I started off with this, right? There's really 3 action items from this presentation, and that's to start or continue. Understand what your wean age is and how do you best feed pigs based on that age. 2, understand how you place groups of pigs on feed. And 3, increase the accuracy of your sow farm feed usage. I'd really like to thank the Layman Conference for the opportunity to speak to you this afternoon. It was a joy and privilege to listen to Dr. Johnson and Dr. Thomas talk about their experiences prior to me. And I really thank you for your time and listening to this presentation. If you do have any additional questions, here's my email address. Feel free to email me just in the email heading. Just put Layman Conference questions and I'll get to you as soon as I can. Thank you for your time and best of luck this fall and winter.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Kellner, for going into the details and looking at the opportunities that we have with batch farrowing. As you said, we've had an excellent session involving 3 people who have gone through the challenges and have come out the opposite side, knowing some of the extra work, but also the opportunities involved in the switch and coming to this new old technology. I'm old enough to remember when we talked about batch farrowing on smaller farms 30 years ago. So thanks again to you, to the audience, and for this opportunity to hold this online discussion on this important area. Thank you very much.